The fluorescent lights hum their endless mechanical prayer above the ICU at Sacred Heart Hospital, and Laura Bennett moves through them like a ghost who learned how to take a pulse. 43 years old, silver threading dark hair, a slight limp in her left leg that worsens when she stands too long, the kind of nurse who arrives before her shift begins and leaves after it ends, asking nothing, expecting nothing, noticed by no one. The antiseptic smell of the ward coats her scrubs, her hands, the back of her throat where it never quite leaves. She's been breathing hospital air for 15 years now. Before that, she breathed something else entirely, but that woman doesn't exist anymore. That woman lives in a locker in a break room on the second floor, folded inside a jacket lining so worn the stitches are coming loose. A faded unit patch from Naval Special Warfare Command. Barely visible. Exactly how she wanted it. Her shift begins at 6 in the evening. She clocks in without speaking to anyone, moves down the corridor with the kind of invisible competence that hospitals run on, not the doctors, not the administrators, but the nurses who know every patient's baseline vital signs by the tremor in their breath, who can hear a decompensating patient from 3 rooms away, who move through crisis like it's a language they learned in childhood. Laura's hands shake sometimes when the ambulance sirens wail outside, a small tremor that stops the moment she touches a patient. Muscle memory. Old habits that won't stay dead no matter how hard she tries to bury them. Patient in Bay 7 is a 71-year-old man with sepsis. His name is Robert. He's been here for 4 days. His daughter calls every 6 hours and asks if he's going to make it, and Laura tells her the truth in a voice so calm it sounds like a metronome. We're monitoring his response to antibiotics. He's stable for now. The daughter cries. Laura's hands move steady. She adjusts the 4, checks the monitor, notes the BP reading, 84/52, too low, not good, but manageable if the new broad-spectrum antibiotics work. They should work. They usually do. She's seen worse. She's much, much worse. She doesn't think about that. She moves to the next patient. In the corner of the ICU, behind the glass partition of the administrative office, Dr. Charles Hargrove watches her. Mid-50s, silver hair that catches the light like something cultivated in a salon, a white coat so pristine it looks like he changes into a fresh one every hour, cufflinks visible when he writes notes, the kind of man whose entire existence is a monument to risk mitigation and statistical excellence. His reputation is built on 3 pillars: 0 malpractice suits in 18 years, mortality rates 3.2% below the hospital median, and the institutional memory of every controversial decision he's ever rejected. He's the chief of medicine at Sacred Heart. He is careful. He is strategic. He sees Laura moving between beds with the efficiency of someone who's done this 1,000 times, and his expression calculates something. The way her hands move. The precision. The speed. The casual competence that takes most residents 5 years to develop and she seems to possess as naturally as breathing. Dr. Hargrove makes a note on his tablet. He doesn't know why. Just an instinct that something about her warrants documentation. Careful observation. The kind of surveillance that looks like administrative diligence. He tells the charge nurse, a woman named Margaret who's worked at Sacred Heart for 12 years and knows which way the wind blows, I want complete documentation on all of Ms. Bennett's procedures. Every single one. Central lines, intubations, medication administration. Everything. Sent to my office by end of each shift. Margaret's eyes flicker. She's been here long enough to recognize the tone. This is not a casual request. This is a superior officer planting seeds. Margaret nods and says, "Of course, doctor," and that's when Laura understands, without anyone saying a word, that she's being watched. Not in the way a supervisor watches to mentor or correct. The way a predator watches before the hunt begins. But she says nothing. She doesn't change her pace or her posture. She continues moving between patients with the same steady efficiency, checking vitals, adjusting medications, listening to the way each body tells its story through monitors and numbers and the sound of breath moving in and out of failing lungs. A ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in Bay 4. A heart monitor beeped a rhythm that was too fast, compensation for low blood pressure, a body working harder to stay alive. These are the languages Laura speaks fluently. The languages no one taught her in nursing school because she learned them first in a much different context. 7 years. 3 continents. Situations where the difference between stable and dead was the space between one decision and the next breath. That was before. That was when she was Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, Classified Medevac Coordinator for JSOC Task Force Operations in Kandahar, running operations that saved lives the official records would never acknowledge. Before the PTSD found her like a predator in her own skin and made it impossible to keep pretending that what she'd seen wouldn't follow her home. Before she understood that the price of silence is paid in insomnia and phantom pain and the way certain sounds make her hands reach for equipment that isn't there. Before she walked away from the Navy and buried herself so deep in civilian life that even her late husband never knew the full extent of what she'd been. She had chosen anonymity. It was the first time in her life that she'd chosen it, and it felt like survival. The afternoon shift melts into evening. Laura takes her break at 8:33 p.m., sitting alone in the break room with a cup of coffee that's long gone cold, staring at nothing in particular. The break room smells like burned coffee and the phantom memory of 1,000 sad lunches eaten in silence. She thinks about Robert in Bay 7. His daughter. The way fear sounds when someone is trying not to let their voice break on the phone. She thinks about that, and she doesn't think about Kandahar, which is the same as thinking about Kandahar because the effort of not thinking is where all the thinking happens. Her locker is on the far wall. Inside, beneath her street clothes and a sweater she never wears, is the jacket. The lining is cotton, faded to the color of old paper. The unit patch is the size of a thumbnail, embroidered in dark thread with lettering so small only someone who knew what they were looking for would see it. She's never looked at it directly in 15 years. She doesn't need to. She knows every thread. When her break ends, she doesn't look at the jacket. She just closes the locker and walks back to the ICU, where the fluorescent lights never stop humming and the patients never stop needing someone to hold the line between them and whatever comes next. The shift moves through evening into night. Bay 3 stabilizes. Bay 8 needs a new 4. Laura finds the vein on her first attempt, something that should take most nurses 2 or 3 tries. The resident in the room watches and makes a mental note to ask her how she's so fast. Laura doesn't explain. She just finishes, documents it, moves to the next task. Robert's vitals improve slightly. The antibiotics are working. His daughter will be relieved tomorrow morning when Laura calls to give her the update. That's something. That's the work. Not the drama of saves or the statistics Dr. Hargrove treasures. Just the quiet, steady presence that keeps people alive through the night when they're too sick to keep themselves alive. At 11:34 p.m., the overhead page crackles to life. The voice is urgent but controlled, which in hospital language means it's bad enough to interrupt the entire building. Level 1 trauma incoming. ETA 8 minutes. Green Beret Colonel Marcus Webb. Critical condition. Septic shock secondary to rare blood infection. All available ICU personnel report immediately. The room shifts. Nurses move faster. The crash carts are checked, supplies restocked, beds prepared for what comes next. Laura hears the name, Colonel Marcus Webb, and something in her chest moves in a way she didn't expect. She ignores it. She focuses on the work. She checks the equipment. She prepares the space. But her hands, for just one moment, stop being steady. Then she takes one measured breath, and they are steady again. The ambulance siren wails closer. The lights in the hospital brighten. Outside the ICU windows, the Houston night presses against the glass like something alive, and somewhere in that darkness, Colonel Marcus Webb is being rushed toward the woman who saved his life once before, 20 years ago, in a city called Kandahar, when he was 8 years old and she was someone else entirely. She doesn't know that yet. She has no idea what's about to walk through those doors. The gurney arrived at 11:36 p.m., wheels squeaking against the tile floor like a warning no one heard yet. Colonel Marcus Webb lay motionless, 42 years old, green beret insignia visible on the combat jacket draped across the rail. His skin had gone the color of old concrete. Temperature 104.3. The sepsis had been eating him from the inside for 72 hours before anyone thought to bring him to Sacred Heart. His daughter Rachel sat in the jump seat beside the stretcher, 24 years old, medical student, eyes red from crying and exhaustion. She gripped his hand the way drowning people grip life preservers, with the kind of force that comes from knowing it might not be enough. The ICU team swarmed around Webb like satellite systems circling something dying, checking lines, calling out numbers that got worse with each passing minute. Heart rate 142. Blood pressure dropping. O2 sat 91 on high flow. Laura Bennett was at Bedford when the doors opened. She had worked 43 straight nights at Sacred Heart without incident, without being noticed, without anyone asking her name. But the second she turned and saw the green beret insignia, something in her chest went absolutely still. The scarred cheekbone. The bone structure of his jaw. The way his chest rose and fell with the ventilator's mechanical rhythm. She knew him. Not as he was now. As he had been 20 years ago, 8 years old, buried under rubble in Kandahar while mortar fire rained down like God's own artillery. She had pulled him from the concrete dust with her own hands, carried him for blocks through sniper fire to the medevac point, and held him for 14 hours of his small body shaking against hers while she sang every Pashto lullaby she could remember, while his blood soaked through her field uniform, while snipers tracked their movement and she didn't let anyone else touch him, not once. That was why she wore her 3rd Navy Cross. Because she wouldn't let go of this boy. And now he was lying on a gurney in front of her, dying again, and this time no one in this hospital was going to save him. Dr. Hargrove rounded 10 minutes later. He was a tall man with the kind of posture that came from knowing his name opened doors, controlled rooms, ended careers with a single phone call. He reviewed Webb's chart without looking at the patient, his eyes moving across the numbers with the expression of someone calculating risk ratios and liability exposure. When he finally spoke, his voice was the sound of institutional authority, measured, certain, and absolutely indifferent to the person on the bed. Necrotizing fasciitis with multidrug-resistant Klebsiella pneumoniae, Hargrove said to the team, not to Webb, never to Webb. Mortality rate 87% with standard antibiotic protocol. We stabilize, manage the sepsis, transfer to Walter Reed. This is beyond our liability threshold for experimental intervention. Rachel's head snapped up. There has to be something. Standard care, Hargrove said. It wasn't a discussion. It was a closing argument. Laura stepped forward. The words came out measured, professional, exactly the way a nurse with no authority should speak to a doctor with all of it. There's an experimental protocol. Combination therapy with the new beta-lactamase inhibitor. Dr. Chen published outcomes from Johns Hopkins last month. 73% survival rate versus 87% mortality with standard treatment. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze, the heart monitor's steady beep, the subtle hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Hargrove turned toward Laura slowly, his movement carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. His eyes traveled from her scrubs to her face to her hands, cataloging her as a problem. Nurse Bennett, he said, and the way he used her name made it sound like a diagnosis. Tell me something. Did your associate's degree happen to cover experimental infectious disease protocols? Or are you playing doctor again? Rachel flinched. Webb's monitor ticked upward. Laura took one measured breath. She didn't look away. Colonel Webb has perhaps 20 hours before septic shock becomes irreversible. The transfer to Walter Reed alone could destabilize him. Dr. Chen's protocol could. Let me be extraordinarily clear, Hargrove said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to the register that worked on board meetings and terrified residents. You are a nurse. Nurses take orders. Nurses do not diagnose. Nurses do not prescribe. Nurses do not advocate for experimental protocols in front of patients' families, giving them false hope based on your internet research and whatever delusions you're nursing about your own competence. He turned to Rachel, his expression shifting to something that almost resembled compassion. Almost. Your father will receive standard care. Nothing experimental. Nothing that jeopardizes this hospital's accreditation on what amounts to a Hail Mary from nursing staff with scope creep issues. Laura's hands trembled slightly, just barely, the kind of tremor that came from restraint, from years of swallowing words that could have ended him. Her voice stayed calm. His daughter is a medical student. She deserves to know all options available. Hargrove's face reddened. The vein in his temple began its own small pulse. Get out of this room. Now. You are reassigned, effective immediately. Post-op recovery. Do not enter this room again. Security has been notified. Laura set down the chart. She looked at Rachel, then at Webb, then back at Hargrove. She said nothing. She simply walked out, each step carrying the weight of someone who had been gutted in front of witnesses and chosen not to bleed where anyone could see it. But that wasn't the worst part. The break room was full when she arrived 5 minutes later. 3 nurses at the corner table, discussing nothing in particular. 2 residents by the vending machine, pretending to debate something about caffeine and staying awake. An attending physician reading a month-old magazine. Laura moved to the chair by the window, the one with a clear view of the parking lot and the rain that had started falling, and sat down. The first nurse stood up. Not slowly, not dramatically. She simply stood and walked to the door. The second and third followed within 30 seconds, a synchronized evacuation that said everything without saying anything at all. The residents exchanged a glance and left. The attending folded his magazine and followed. In 90 seconds, the break room had emptied itself of everyone except Laura, who sat motionless at the window, watching the rain come down on Houston like a verdict. She understood. Every person who'd remained sitting would have been blacklisted by Hargrove within a month. He had 4 board members on speed dial. He had connections to the Texas Medical Board. He had the kind of institutional authority that didn't need to raise its voice to end someone's career. They were protecting themselves. They were doing what every rational person in a hospital does when power says stay or suffer. And Laura didn't blame them. She didn't blame them at all. She took one measured breath. A single tear escaped, just one, the kind of tear that comes from muscle memory, from holding too much for too long. She wiped it away without breaking composure, without letting her expression shift even by a fraction. The room remained silent. The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent hum. The rain hammered the parking lot outside like applause for nothing. When Laura arrived the next morning, the unit board had been updated. A formal reprimand, printed and laminated, her name in bold capital letters, Bennett, L., formal reprimand for overstepping scope of practice, unauthorized medical advice to patient family, insubordination. 20 staff members saw it pass by. No one met her eyes. No one said a word. She clocked in at 6:59 a.m. and worked her shift in complete isolation. Every interaction was professional, clinical, perfect. When she checked beds, she was efficient. When she documented, she was meticulous. When she saw Rachel Webb in the hallway at 2 p.m., she said nothing, did nothing, acknowledged nothing. The mask was sealed. But Colonel Webb's numbers were getting worse. Heart rate 142. Blood pressure 88/54. Lactate rising. The septic shock was approaching like a vehicle with no brakes, and by midnight, Laura knew it would arrive. She knew because she had seen septic shock before. She had watched it devour young soldiers, had held their hands while their organs began the process of shutting down, had sung to them in languages that weren't hers, had tried everything. She had learned what it meant when medicine became theater. The shift stretched into a prison of her own making. Laura moved through Sacred Heart's corridors in deliberate isolation, her presence a toxin everyone had agreed to quarantine. When she entered Webb's room at 6 a.m. for vitals, the respiratory therapist left without greeting. When she restocked the crash cart at noon, the resident turned her shoulder and walked the opposite direction. The message was crystalline: Hargrove had weaponized the staff. One nurse's advocacy for the wrong protocol became contagion. Better to avoid her than risk catching whatever career-ending disease she carried. She checked the monitors anyway. Always the monitors. By 2 p.m., Webb's condition had begun its descent. Heart rate climbing steadily, 110, then 118, now holding at 127. His blood pressure had dropped from 94/58 to 88/54, that particular flatness that meant his body was losing its war with infection. The lactate in his blood was rising, that telltale marker of cellular suffocation, tissues screaming for oxygen they weren't getting. Early septic shock. The slow catastrophe. Laura had seen it 100 times in 100 different lives, and she knew the rhythm: first the fever spikes, then the confusion, then the organ dominoes begin to topple. She documented everything in the medical record with forensic precision. Every temperature reading. Every blood gas. Every declining oxygen saturation. The documentation was not for Webb's benefit, it was a paper trail. If she moved without authorization, if she deviated from Hargrove's protocols, this record would be scrutinized by lawyers and hospital boards. It would be her evidence or her indictment. Possibly both. She knew how this game functioned. She had seen careers atomized by a single act of disobedience, no matter how medically justified. But the alternative was watching a man die while she stood and did nothing. The alternative was holding a child she had already saved once, watching the light leave his eyes for the second time in his life, and knowing she could have stopped it. Hargrove made rounds at 3:15 p.m., his white coat moving through the ICU like a sail catching wind. He was meticulous about his performance, speaking with the attending physicians, nodding thoughtfully at monitor readouts, the picture of clinical control. When he approached Webb's bed, his eyes passed over Laura as if she were equipment that had already been decommissioned. He glanced at the vital signs displayed above the bed, then at the lab values Rachel had pulled up on the workstation. His jaw tightened fractionally. Continue current management protocol, he said to the room generally, to no one specifically. No experimental interventions. No deviations from standard septic shock management. Is that understood? Rachel looked at him, then at her father on the bed, then back at Hargrove. Her mouth opened. Closed. She nodded. Hargrove turned to leave, then paused. He looked directly at Laura for the first time all day. Nurse Bennett, I trust you understand the parameters of your role here. Patient care follows the attending physician's orders. Nothing else. Nothing more. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in surgical tones, but a command nonetheless. The message was direct: any intervention beyond Hargrove's explicit instructions would be recorded, reported, and weaponized. His authority was a cage with Laura's career as the lock. Understood, Dr. Hargrove, Laura said. Her voice was even. Professional. Emptied of everything except compliance. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, then nodded and walked out. By 8 p.m., Webb's oxygen saturation had begun its slow descent. 94, then 92, now holding at 90, that borderline zone where the lungs start to fail. His breathing had become labored, like a runner at mile 20 of a marathon, pulling air in through a closing throat. The ventilator he wasn't yet on would soon become mandatory. Hargrove's conservative protocol dictated standard sedation, antibiotics, and observation. Wait for the body to fight back. Sometimes bodies did. Sometimes they didn't. But that wasn't the worst part. At 10 p.m., one of the residents, a young doctor named Chen who had been friendly to Laura for months before Hargrove's decree, approached her near the medication dispensary. I'm sorry, Chen said quietly. About all this. If I could. Don't, Laura said. Not unkindly. Just a fact. You have a family. You have student loans. You don't risk your career on a case everyone's already decided you're losing. Chen's face shifted. But if he? He will, or he won't. Either way, it won't be because of you. She wasn't angry at Chen. She was angry at systems that made decent people complicit by threatening the things they loved. She was angry at Hargrove, who had calculated correctly that most people would choose survival over heroism. Most people were wise to make that calculation. Laura had made it once too, walked away from the Navy and the weight of command, chosen quiet and anonymity over the endless grinding of combat and consequence. She had earned the right to be quiet. Now quiet felt like collaboration. The night shift began at 11 p.m. Laura took vitals on all 12 of her assigned patients with methodical precision, each task executed flawlessly, each interaction professional and empty of genuine connection. She was a ghost moving through Sacred Heart's corridors, visible but not really present, competent but not trusted. The other nurses gave her wide berth. Word had spread the way word always spread in hospitals. The nurse who questioned the attending had been burned, and her ashes were a warning. At 1:56 a.m., the monitors above Webb's bed began to scream. The alarm tone cut through the ICU like a knife through silk. Not the soft warning of a falling oxygen saturation, but the full red alert screech that meant catastrophic physiologic failure. Laura's head snapped up from the medication cart. The monitor display showed the story in brutal detail: oxygen saturation plummeting, 88, now 84, now 78. His heart rate spiking to 142, that frantic rhythm that meant his body knew it was drowning. The ventilator he still didn't have was sucking in and out in rapid panic gasps. She was moving before the code team was even called. Moving because the body remembers what the mind has been told to forget. 20 years of training, 100 combat rescue operations, the muscle memory of watching young soldiers die in the desert, all of it came back as muscle memory now, hands and feet moving on automatic. Laura reached Webb's bedside as Rachel was pushing back from the chair where she'd been sleeping. The girl's face went pale. She looked at the monitors, then at her father, then at Laura with the expression of someone watching the world tilt off its axis. "What's happening?" Rachel whispered. Webb was seizing. Not the violent full-body seizure of status epilepticus, but the small muscle tremors of hypoxia, that particular jittering that meant his brain was beginning to starve for oxygen. His body was shutting down system by system, the cascade accelerating now, the point of no return rushing toward them like a freight train. Hargrove arrived in less than 90 seconds, which was faster than Laura would have expected. His hair was uncombed, his shirt half-buttoned. He had clearly been in the call room. He took in the scene with one sweep of his eyes, Webb gasping, the monitors screaming, the oxygen saturation now at 72 and falling. "Get him on 100% oxygen," Hargrove barked at the respiratory therapist. "Push 2 milligrams midazolam for sedation. Someone get me a blood gas." The team moved like choreography they had practiced before. But there was something in Hargrove's voice that Laura heard clearly, panic masked as control. He was going through the motions, executing the protocol, but the protocol wasn't working because the protocol had never been designed for what was actually happening to Colonel Webb. His left lung was collapsed. Not slowly. Not partially. Completely. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of thing that killed people in minutes because the collapsed lung was pushing on his heart, preventing it from filling, slowly suffocating him from the inside out. And the only thing that would save him was a needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, a procedure that took 45 seconds and required exactly 0 authorization from anyone but the person holding the needle. Laura stepped to the bedside. "His left lung is collapsed," she said. Not a question. A diagnosis. The voice came out different than it had earlier, not deferential, not apologetic. A voice that had issued orders in dust storms and under fire, that had directed young soldiers to move and breathe and survive. His intention pneumothorax. You need to decompress that lung in the next 3 minutes or his heart stops. Nothing else you're doing will matter. Hargrove's head snapped toward her. His face went the color of old concrete. "You are not authorized to make clinical assessments," he said. The words were precise. Ice edged. "You are not authorized to." Webb's body convulsed. His oxygen saturation hit 65. The monitor's tone shifted to the deeper alarm that meant profound crisis, the sound like a siren in a collapsing building. "The needle," Laura said. She wasn't asking. "Now." Hargrove opened his mouth to speak. Some order, some assertion of authority. Something that would protect him and his protocols and his defensive medicine while the man on the bed died in front of them. Webb stopped breathing. The monitors flatlined for a half-second that lasted a lifetime. Asystole. The worst rhythm. The one that meant the heart had given up the fight entirely. Laura's hands were already moving. She'd been a senior chief petty officer in the Navy Medical Corps for 12 years before she became invisible. She'd done this procedure on 17 different people, many of them under conditions far worse than a well-lit ICU. Her hands knew the landmark, knew the angle, knew the depth. They moved like they were separate from her body entirely, muscle memory overriding every rule and law and career protection she had ever agreed to respect. She didn't ask. Didn't wait. Didn't request permission from a man who was still opening his mouth to deny her. The 14-gauge angiocath needle went in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. There was a sensation like breaking through skin and fascia and pleura, a moment of resistance and then give, and then the hiss of air escaping from a lung that had been pressurized like a tire. The sound of tension leaving the chest cavity. The sound of physics correcting itself. The sound of a man's heart suddenly able to beat again. Hargrove had gone very still. Everyone in the room had gone very still. The only sound was the ventilator finding its rhythm again, oxygen flooding into Webb's lungs, the monitor's tone shifting from the scream of asystole to the steady beep of sinus rhythm reasserting itself. 84. 90. 92. Webb's oxygen saturation climbing. His heart rate dropping from the panicked 142 to something almost manageable. His body, given one more chance, was beginning to fight again. "Get me a chest tube set up," the respiratory therapist said. No one contradicted her. Hargrove was still standing motionless, watching the monitors show vital signs returning to the land of the living. Rachel made a sound somewhere between a sob and a prayer. "He's stabilizing," someone said. Laura stepped back from the bedside. Her hands were steady. Everything was steady. She had done what needed to be done, and now the consequences would begin their particular gravity. She could already hear Hargrove's phone calls being made in his mind, could already see the security footage being reviewed, could already feel the weight of her career settling into the basement of history. But Colonel Webb's oxygen saturation was 94 now, still climbing. His heart was beating. His lungs were expanding. The child she had saved in Kandahar 20 years ago, pulled from rubble with dust in his hair and terror in his eyes, was going to live another night. She had 10 hours of her shift left. She had no idea what would happen in the next 10 hours. But in this moment, as Hargrove's face was being carefully rearranged into an expression of clinical control, as Rachel was trembling with something that looked like hope, as the ICU staff moved through the business of saving a life they had nearly let slip away, Laura knew only one thing. It was the same thing she had known standing in the ruins of Kandahar. Some things mattered more than safety. Some things mattered more than quiet. And sometimes you didn't choose the moment where you had to be brave, you just recognized it when it arrived, and you moved. The monitor screamed. 3 sharp beeps that turned the ICU into a lightning strike. Laura was already moving before her brain caught up with what her eyes saw, the oxygen saturation number dropping like a stone through water, 92, 88, 84, 78. Colonel Webb's body was rigid on the bed, every muscle locked into seizure, his chest rising but not falling, the breath trapped inside him like a fist. She didn't hesitate. Didn't ask permission. Didn't wait for Dr. Hargrove or anyone else who'd spent the last 12 hours explaining why she couldn't help, why she wasn't qualified, why she needed to step back. She ran into the ICU bay and grabbed Webb's shoulders, turning him slightly onto his left side to see what she already knew from the vital signs, unilateral breath sounds on the right, the left side of his chest moving but the right completely still, like half his body had forgotten how to breathe. His trachea was beginning to deviate. She could feel it. The shifting of cartilage under her fingertips, millimeter by millimeter, as the collapsed lung pushed his airway sideways. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space with nowhere to go, compressing the lung, collapsing it, pushing against his heart. 8 minutes. Maybe 10. That's what she had before his heart would stop completely. She moved to the crash cart without running, without panic, with the terrible calm that comes from knowing exactly what has to happen and knowing she's the only one in the room who understands the timeline. Her hands found the 14-gauge needle before her eyes registered which drawer she'd opened. Muscle memory. The kind that lives in tendons and bone, not in conscious thought. The kind she'd built in forward operating bases, in desert compounds, in medevac helicopters over Helmand Province where there were no doctors and the only choice was knowing what to do or watching someone die. The needle felt like coming home. She counted ribs with her fingertips. 1. 2. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomy her hands had learned before her brain understood it was learning. She didn't look up. Didn't check if anyone had stopped her. Didn't register Dr. Hargrove's voice somewhere behind her, calling her name with a tone that suggested he was witnessing his last remaining thread of institutional control about to snap. The needle went in. Not deep. Just far enough. Straight between the ribs at the angle she'd calculated 1,000 times on bodies that were bleeding out on stretchers she could barely carry, in conditions that made the ICU look like a surgical suite at Johns Hopkins. There was resistance. Then breakthrough. The needle punched through the parietal pleura like breaking surface tension on water. Air rushed out. A hiss like a tire deflating, like a sniper's breath, like the sound of a pressure valve releasing catastrophe back into the realm of the manageable. The sound of survival. Webb gasped. His body went slack. The seizure stopped the way a light stops when you flip the switch. Laura didn't move her hands. Didn't look back. Kept her eyes on the monitor as the numbers began their climb. 78, 82, 88, 94. Sinus rhythm. His heart rate dropping from the 160s toward something that wouldn't trigger another seizure, something that wouldn't kill him in the next 5 minutes. The room was frozen. That particular kind of silent that happens when someone does something nobody thought was possible. Laura taped the needle in place with her left hand, still holding position with her right, muscle and bone and years of training and a singular focus that had carried her through 7 years of operations that still didn't have names in any classified database. Chest tube tray. Now. Her voice was different. Not pleading. Not deferential. Commanding. The kind of voice that comes from someone who has made life or death decisions in actual deserts, actual firefights, actual moments where hesitation meant body bags. Propofol for sedation. 20 micrograms fentanyl. And someone get me the experimental antibiotic protocol because he's got 8 hours left before septic shock kills him if we don't start it immediately. The ICU staff moved. Not because Laura was their supervisor. Not because she had any authority on any organizational chart. They moved because her voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who knew what she was talking about, and in a room where a man was currently not dying because of something she'd just done, that authority was louder than any title. Rachel appeared with the chest tube tray, her eyes wet. Laura took the sterile field, popped it open with one hand, and guided the larger bore tube into the space the needle had created, positioning it at the 5th intercostal space, anterior axillary line, draining the trapped air into a collection chamber that immediately began filling with the pale fluid that proved she'd been correct, proved the anatomy she saw was real, proved this man was still alive because she'd moved when everyone else had stopped. 2 more 4 lines. Laura's hands working with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this 100 times, in worse conditions, with less equipment, with less help. The clock on the wall read 2:37 a.m. The experimental protocol began to drip. Antibiotics that Dr. Hargrove had forbidden, running into Webb's veins now, 8 hours ahead of septic shock, 8 hours that might mean the difference between a funeral and a recovery. Then Dr. Hargrove was in the doorway. His face was the color of raw meat. His hands were shaking. Not from concern. From rage. From the understanding that Laura had just crossed a line he couldn't tolerate, a line that wasn't about protocol or scope of practice or professional boundaries. It was about control. He had tried to control who lived and who died, and she had taken that control and dropped it on the floor like a contaminated surgical mask. What you have just done is practice medicine without a license. His voice was shaking. His eyes were moving between Laura and the monitors, between the evidence of his wrong decision and the evidence of her right one. That is a felony. That is criminal. Security. Remove her. Remove her now and call the police. Laura pulled off her gloves. Drop them into the biohazard bin. Her hands didn't shake. That was the thing about real danger. By the time you understood you were in it, the fear had already converted into clarity. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. Colonel Webb will live. That's all that matters. The words hung in the ICU like a final verdict. Two security guards appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable, looking like they understood they were escorting someone out not because she'd done something wrong but because she'd done something that made the powerful feel small. Laura moved toward them with her shoulders back, her head level, the posture of someone who had walked toward worse things than a firing, who had moved toward actual gunfire, who understood that shame only works on people who feel they've done something to be ashamed of. She saw Rachel mouth thank you, watched tears track down the younger nurse's face, saw the other staff members stand a little straighter because they'd watched someone choose a life over a job, choose a patient over a paycheck. As the security guards walked her toward the elevator, Laura didn't look back. But she heard the monitors behind her beeping their steady rhythm. She heard Webb's oxygen saturation stable at 96%. She heard the sound of something right happening in a hospital where the administration had decided wrong was acceptable. By 3:33 a.m., she was sitting in her car in the parking lot. By 6:15 a.m., her phone had 3 voicemails from hospital attorneys. By 10 a.m., Dr. Hargrove had called for board members before dawn, had contacted the Texas Medical Board with allegations of practicing medicine without a license, had brought in hospital attorneys with access to every minute of security footage, building a termination case so airtight that by noon a certified letter arrived at her address informing her she was terminated for gross negligence and scope violation. By 2 p.m., 2 lawyers from the hospital had informed her she was facing criminal charges. By 6 p.m., Laura stood in the rain at the public cemetery in northwest Houston, her feet sinking into grass that had turned to mud, her hand touching the granite stone with her husband's name carved into it. The water was cold. The rain came sideways, hammered down like something angry, like the sky was trying to wash away everything she'd built in the last 15 years of quiet, everything she'd protected by staying invisible, everything she'd sacrificed by choosing peace over recognition. She kneeled. The mud soaked through her jeans. I saved that boy 20 years ago in Kandahar, she whispered. Pulled him from rubble during a firefight. Held him through 14 hours of medevac while snipers tried to kill us both. And I saved him again last night. But I can't save myself from this. I don't know how to keep fighting anymore. The rain kept coming. Laura sat there for an hour, watching the water pool against the stone, watching the sky darken, letting the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket, the patch nobody at Sacred Heart had ever seen, the patch she'd kept hidden for 2 decades like it was evidence of a crime, get heavier and heavier with the weight of who she actually was. The rain kept coming. Laura sat there for an hour, watching the water pool against the stone, watching the sky darken, letting the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket, the patch nobody at Sacred Heart had ever seen, the patch she'd kept hidden for 2 decades like it was evidence of a crime, get heavier and heavier with the weight of who she actually was. She didn't drive home. She drove to the hospital instead, sat in the parking lot for another 2 hours, watching shift changes happen without her. The security guard who'd escorted her out earlier walked past her car and didn't recognize her in the darkness. That was when she knew it was over. Not just her job. The whole careful architecture of invisibility she'd spent 15 years constructing. At 5:27 a.m., while Houston still slept, Dr. Hargrove was on the phone. The first call went to a board member named Sterling, a man with enough hospital investments to choke a corporation. "We have a liability situation," Hargrove said, his voice steady, almost sympathetic. "A nurse performed a surgical procedure without authorization. Needle decompression. On a patient I explicitly forbade intervention on." The pause on the line was short. Then Sterling's voice, "Is the patient stable?" Hargrove didn't answer the question. He answered with numbers. 200 million in liability insurance. One lawsuit from the family and we're exposed across 3 states. Sterling called 3 more board members before breakfast. By 6:24 a.m., the narrative had already hardened. The nurse had gone rogue. The nurse had endangered the patient. The nurse had practiced medicine without a license. By 7:15 a.m., Hargrove had filed a formal complaint with the Texas Medical Board. The document was a masterpiece of bureaucratic weaponization. It cited the needle decompression as unauthorized invasive procedure, the decision to intervene as exceeding scope of practice by a registered nurse, and Laura's actions as practicing medicine without licensure, a felony under Texas Health and Safety Code 165.002. He attached the security footage, 17 minutes of compressed video showing Laura's hands moving with precision, showing the needle going in at the second intercostal space, showing the hiss of air escaping from the pneumothorax, showing Colonel Webb's oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 91. The footage showed a woman saving a life. Hargrove's narrative made it look like a criminal committing a felony. Hospital attorneys were in the conference room by 8 a.m., reviewing the security footage frame by frame, timestamp by timestamp. They watched Laura prepare the needle. They watched her locate the anatomical landmarks. They watched her hand steady as a surgical laser, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, and that's what made her dangerous in their eyes. Experience meant intent. Competence meant liability. They built their case not on what Laura did, but on who she had to be to do it that well. By 10 a.m., the termination paperwork was ready. By 11:16 a.m., it was signed by 3 administrators who'd never met her. By noon, the security guard, a different one, this time with genuine sympathy in his eyes, walked her to her locker, waited while she gathered her things, and didn't speak because there was nothing to say that would matter. Laura entered the locker in 6 minutes. Her stethoscope. Her penlights. Her trauma shears with her initials engraved on the handle. The unit patch stayed in the jacket. She wasn't going to take it. For a moment, standing there in the break room where everyone had stood and walked out in silence 3 days ago, she thought about leaving it behind on the bench. A message. A confession. A final goodbye to the woman she'd pretended to be. But she didn't. She took it with her. The security guard drove her to the employee exit at the front of the building, the same exit where senior physicians parked their cars, where hospital administrators entered through glass doors that hissed open automatically. Laura's access badge stopped working at the entrance. She got halfway through the second set of doors before the electronic lock engaged with an audible click. The guard used his access to let her through. Nobody in the lobby looked at her. In a hospital, people in uniform leaving aren't remarkable. But people in scrubs being escorted out by security always are. By 6 p.m. that evening, Laura stood at her husband's grave. The cemetery was empty except for the rain and the wind that moved through the oak trees like something with breath. Robert had been gone for years. They'd met at a support group for PTSD, both of them trying to know what they'd seen, both of them too broken to ask each other about it. He died of a heart attack at 52, and she'd never told him why she woke up screaming, never told him about Kandahar, never told him about the boy she'd pulled from rubble, never told him that she'd become a nurse because she couldn't stop being a soldier. "I saved that boy 20 years ago," she whispered to the stone. "I saved him again last night. But I can't save myself from this. And I don't know how to keep fighting anymore." The rain hammered down harder, and Laura didn't move. She let it soak through her jacket, through the unit patch hidden in the lining, water running down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away because in her experience, tears and rain looked the same to the world. Nobody was watching. That was the thing she'd been good at, nobody watching. Nobody asking. Nobody knowing. She drove to a motel near the airport, paid cash for a room, and lay in the dark listening to the sound of traffic on the interstate. Somewhere out there, Colonel Marcus Webb was recovering. The experimental antibiotic protocol had worked. His vitals were stable. His infection was clearing. She'd given him that. She'd saved him the way she'd saved him 20 years ago in the rubble outside Kandahar, the same way she'd saved 217 other people whose names she didn't know, whose lives she'd never see, whose survival had meant nothing when it came time to decide if she was a hero or a criminal. 3 days later, a Taliban commander named Zahir Amin arrived at Sacred Heart for cardiac surgery. He was 62 years old, converted to U.S. intelligence asset status 7 years ago, and his face went pale when he saw Laura in the hallway outside the cardiac ICU. He stopped walking. His security detail stopped walking. And for 5 seconds, nobody in that corridor moved except for the fluorescent lights buzzing their mechanical song overhead. He knew her face. He'd seen it through binoculars in Kandahar 20 years ago, watched through a rifle scope as an American medic held a dying child under sniper fire, singing in Pashto, her body curled around the boy's like she could shield him from bullets with flesh and will alone. Zahir had been on the other side of that firefight. He'd been the one holding the rifle. He'd had the shot, and he hadn't taken it. "You," he said, and the word in his accented English carried the weight of 2 decades. "You were the medic." Laura didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her stillness was confirmation enough. Within the hour, Zahir had called a contact at the Pentagon. Within 6 hours, Colonel Marcus Webb, recovered enough to sit up without assistance, was looking at Laura across a hospital room, and his eyes were the eyes of an 8-year-old boy who suddenly understood that the person who'd saved him had just lost everything. "Senior Chief Petty Officer," he said, reading from his own medical file, where he'd written her full designation in his own hand. Not her first name. Not nurse. The rank. The title. The honor. The door opened 20 minutes later and a SEAL team leader named Mitchell walked in, and he didn't ask questions because he didn't need to. One of his men had made a phone call, and that phone call had triggered clearances, had opened files, had resurrected a service record that had been intentionally buried 15 years ago. "Bronze Star," Mitchell said, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "Silver Star." Pause. 2 Purple Hearts. Another pause. And a Navy Cross. Each medal got its own sentence. Each sentence got its own weight. Laura listened and felt something inside her chest loosen, like a knot someone else had tied that she'd finally been given permission to undo. 3 Navy Crosses, Mitchell corrected himself. "We were counting wrong. There's one they added posthumously that transfers to you. And there's the one from Kandahar." An FBI liaison named Garrett appeared next, this one holding a classified folder that she opened without ceremony. "You ran medevac operations for the Joint Special Operations Command between 2003 and 2008. You had direct authority over 13 medical personnel. You coordinated with 160th SAW Night Stalkers, conducted 74 combat medical insertions, and your decisions directly resulted in 217 Americans and Allied personnel returning home alive instead of in flag-draped boxes. 17 of those 217 now serve in Congress. 2 are generals." Laura didn't speak. She'd learned a long time ago that her silence was louder than any word she could say. The 2-star admiral arrived at Sacred Heart at 3 p.m. the next afternoon with CNN cameras following him through the front doors like remoras following a shark. He walked through the main lobby with his aide, his cover tucked under one arm, his bearing the kind of compressed authority that made security personnel stand straighter. He didn't go to the ICU. He went to the administrative offices on the 3rd floor. He went directly to Dr. Hargrove's office. What happened next took exactly 4 minutes. The admiral walked into Hargrove's office, closed the door, and when it opened again, Hargrove's face had gone the color of old concrete. The admiral walked back out, the door closing behind him, and then he walked directly to the center of the main lobby, where a crowd had already begun gathering because the CNN cameras had done their work. He stood in front of the hospital directory, the elevator banks, the family waiting area, and he spoke directly to the cameras with Hargrove visible through his office window on the 3rd floor, watching from behind glass. As of this moment, Dr. Marcus Hargrove is relieved of all medical privileges at Sacred Heart Hospital. He is being terminated for cause, obstruction of care to a Medal of Honor recipient, falsification of medical records, and gross negligence in patient advocacy. His medical license is being referred to the Texas Medical Board for disciplinary action. Let it be clear, when a physician prioritizes his reputation over patient survival, when he weaponizes authority to silence medical professionals who advocate for life, he has forfeited his place in medicine. The camera swung to Hargrove's face in the office window. He was standing now, his mouth open, his hand halfway to the phone that he suddenly realized wouldn't save him. By that evening, Hargrove had resigned from Sacred Heart. By the next morning, every hospital in Houston had quietly blacklisted him. By the end of the week, his medical license was under formal review. His lawyer called offering settlement terms, resignation from all positions, withdrawal of all charges against Laura, agreement not to practice medicine in Texas ever again. In exchange, the hospital wouldn't pursue criminal charges for falsifying reports and endangering a patient. Laura was in a Pentagon conference room when the offer came through. She signed without reading it. She didn't care about revenge. She cared that Colonel Webb was walking. She cared that the experimental protocol had worked. She cared that she could stop running from who she was. 6 months later, a nurse named Davis was shopping at a strip mall in northwest Houston when she saw a folding table with a banner, supplemental insurance, low rates. Behind it sat Dr. Hargrove, 60 pounds heavier, wearing a suit that had come from a discount outlet, his medical license laminated and propped against the table like a relic nobody wanted. He saw Davis and his face crumbled. She didn't say a word. She just kept walking. That same afternoon, Laura stood in the Pentagon in her dress whites, the uniform she hadn't worn in 15 years, the smell of pressed cotton and boot polish surrounding her like a memory made tangible. Colonel Marcus Webb stood beside her, also in dress uniform, moving without assistance now, he's bearing the straightness of a man who'd learned how to carry his own weight again. The Secretary of Defense stood at a podium in front of a room filled with officers, admirals, generals, and the press corps that had made Laura's story into something bigger than either of them could have imagined. Today we honor Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, the Secretary said. Her 7 years of classified combat medicine saved 217 American and Allied lives. Her decision to step away from active duty was an act of courage, choosing to heal herself rather than accept honors while suffering. But today, she returns not to active duty, but to public acknowledgement of a sacrifice that should never have been silent. Behind the Secretary's podium stood a frame containing the faded unit patch from Laura's jacket lining, preserved behind glass, lit by small exhibition lights like it was artwork in a museum. When the ceremony ended, Webb approached her. They hadn't spoken privately since the reveal at Sacred Heart. He stopped 3 feet away, this Green Beret colonel, and his eyes were wet. "You held me for 14 hours, he said. "I was 8 years old and buried in rubble and you sang to me in Pashto. You told me I was safe. I joined the army to find you, to thank you. And you saved my life twice." Laura's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as Webb embraced her, and the room of hardened military officers looked away, understanding that some moments aren't for witnesses. That next week, Laura returned to Sacred Heart, not as a staff nurse, but as the new director of emergency medical training, a position created specifically for her, a position that would let her teach the next generation of nurses how to advocate for patients, how to recognize when institutional fear was wrong, how to choose life over liability. When she walked through the ICU on her first day, every staff member stood. Not out of fear anymore. Out of respect. She stopped at the break room, the same one that had emptied around her months ago. Now it was full of nurses waiting to meet her. When she entered, the room erupted in applause. She held up one hand for silence, took one measured breath, and said, "What happened to me should never happen to any nurse who advocates for their patient. We're changing that, starting today." The camera pulled back through the ICU window to show Laura teaching a group of residents, her hand steady, her voice calm, Colonel Webb visible in the background speaking to a group of visiting Green Berets about the medic who saved him twice. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever witnessed someone's sacrifice go unrecognized, someone's heroism buried beneath bureaucracy, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments. What would you have done in Laura's position? Share your thoughts. And if you know a nurse, a medic, a healthcare worker who deserves to have their story heard, tag them below. We're listening.